Thanks, Stephen. You really filled this room. Dear God, open our hearts once again as we pause in the middle of this month. Consider what it is to be your people in the midst of all that confronts us. Amen. You may have read the lovely book by Anne Lamott called Bird by Bird about writing and the writing life. She begins with this story. 30 years ago, she says, my older brother, who was 10 years old at the time, was trying to get a report on birds written that he'd had 3 months to write, which was due the next day. We were out at our family cabin in Bolinas, and he was at the kitchen table close to tears, surrounded by binder paper and pencils and unopened books on birds, immobilized by the hugeness of the task ahead. Then my father sat down beside him, put his arm around my brother's shoulder and said, bird by bird, buddy, just take it bird by bird. Life so easily overwhelms us. Our first great task, is not to prevail, but simply to cope, to get to a place where you can reason wisely. It takes a lot of courage to be a human being. I remember holding my daughter for the first time. I'd been programmed to think newborns didn't open their eyes, and hers were wide open, taking in the world from her first moment. Very curious. Those sea-colored baby eyes, had no hint of fear, no hint of knowing what would be required of her. Like all babies, she just ate and slept and sighed when she was full. And the world was only as wide as our apartment and safe as her mother's arms. For most babies, that's the way. But then education begins. I remember what I felt when I found out that bees sting, and roses come with thorns, and that children will push you and sometimes throw rocks. I remember discovering nausea for the very first time. And I remember too well that when your parents decide it's time to move to another city, there is nothing in the world you can do about it. All of that was part of growing up, But year after year, we add to our experience of living. We throw our little weight around, find out what will budge and what will not, and gradually we gain a sense of our own power. We find out how powerful the words yes and no are, and are not, and with whom. Some of us get so carried away with this that we come to think we can actually control our lives. We come of age and decide what to be when we grow up, or what to be first. We get credit cards and mortgages. We take supplements. We work out. We space our children 2 or 3 years apart, and 7 times out of 10, maybe, things work. We have taken charge of our lives. We have learned to live intentionally, and living intentionally may be enough until something really dramatic happens, something unintentional, something that blindsides us, like a divorce or a pandemic, a downsizing or a diagnosis. It's like a recurring dream a friend of mine had most of her life, where she gets in the back seat of a car and it takes off with only her in it. It fills her with panic. I've lost control, we say, but it isn't true at all, because as we all know, we human beings do not control our lives, right? I've said it myself, but when things careen out of control, what we lose is the illusion, right, that we've lost control, because we've never been in control in the first place. And it's a hard lesson to learn. So hard because we go back and back to the blackboard, right? Thinking there must be some way that we can work this out. And this is not a bad impulse because, of course, sometimes we can, but not always, and that is what really galls us. We want to live in a world with no leaks, no scars, no black holes, but somehow we wound up here on Earth where everything is so fragile. The war in Ukraine, just goes on and on and on. The planet is warming faster than anyone expected. They have to take coral out of the ocean in Florida and put it in cool water in people's bathtubs in order to keep it alive. This place will break your heart. Seems to do it just about every week. And someone once said that's why it's called the human condition, because it's like asthma or myopia. It's a condition that we live with. And it's mostly terrific here, but it has certain built-in shortcomings. Some rocks will budge and some will not. We cannot fly. None of us will live forever. We can't choose the circumstances of our life. Some, but not all. And even when we take months or years to make huge decisions about who to live with for the rest of our lives, we find there are so many surprises that we didn't think about. What in the world happened? We cannot choose these things. We can only choose how, of course, to respond to them. And the Bible is full to bursting with this. So this morning we heard the story from the life of Jacob, who is such an operator in his life. As a young man, he's always massaging everything, manipulating everyone. Then he spends his entire adult life running away from his brother Esau, who he'd swindled big time long before. Esau said he's going to kill Jacob if he ever gets him in a corner. And finally, Jacob decides it's time to stop running. He just gets to the place where he cannot do it anymore. I love Rabbi Harold Kushner's reflections on Jacob. He says, quote, "My favorite prayer in the whole Bible is the one Jacob offers just before wrestling with the angel in the book of Genesis. He's at the same riverbank where, as a teenager, he'd prayed a very immature prayer. Keep me safe, make me rich, and I will thank you and worship you like crazy." And now 20 years later, he comes back much more mature. There's no bargaining. There's no Santa Claus list. His prayer is simply, I have to do something hard. I know it's right, and I'm not sure I can do it. If you help me, maybe I can do it. If you leave me on my own, I know I'll fall on my face the way I have every other time I've tried to do that. Kushner says, for me, that's prayer. It doesn't change the world. Jacob's about to meet his brother Esau, who said, the next time I meet you, I'm going to kill you. Jacob doesn't ask God to turn Esau into a pussycat. He doesn't ask God to strike Esau with amnesia so he'll forget his anger. Rather, Jacob says to God, I've spent my whole life running from confrontation. I'm tired of running. Help me face up to this and get through this crisis. Kushner says with confidence, that's prayer. Don't change the world, God. Don't take away my problems. Don't make my road smooth, but give me the grace to walk it, no matter how rocky it is. So Jacob finds out something a lot of people find out when they get to about the age of 40. He thinks he's been wrestling with other people all those years, when in fact, all along, he's actually been wrestling with himself. We get inklings of this. The lucky ones finally find the power and the courage to face up to it. It's scary. Well, Joseph Campbell once said, it's by going down into the abyss that we recover the treasures of life. Where you stumble, there lies your treasure. The very cave you are afraid to enter most turns out to be the source of all that you are looking for. So if the story of Jacob is to be taken fully in, facing our fear is not just an act of courage that we chalk up as a virtuous thing. It also can lead to a blessing. Rachel Naomi Remen wrote a whole book on the subject of blessing once. It's about her Jewish grandfather mostly, and her as a young child. She says this. She says, almost the last story that my grandfather told me was about a man called Jacob, who had been attacked in the night as he slept alone by the bank of a river. He had been traveling, and when he'd stopped to make his meal and settle down to sleep, the place had seemed safe enough. But it was not so. He awakened to find himself gripped by muscular arms and pinned to the ground. It was so dark that he couldn't see his enemy, but he could feel his power. So gathering all his strength, he began to struggle. How long did they struggle, Grandpa? I asked with some anxiety, says Rachel. A long time, my grandfather replied, but the darkness does not last forever. Eventually it was dawn, and as the light came up, Jacob saw that he had been wrestling with an angel. With the coming of the light, the angel let go of Jacob and tried to leave, but Jacob held him fast. Let me go, the angel told Jacob. The light has come. But Jacob said, I will not let you go until you bless me. The angel struggled hard, for he wanted badly to escape, but Jacob held him close. And so the angel gave him his blessing. I was very relieved. Did he leave then, Grandpa? Is that the end? I asked. Yes, my grandfather said, but Jacob's leg was hurt in the struggle. Before the angel left, he touched him on the place where he was hurt. This was something I could understand, because often my mother did this too. To help it get better, Grandpa? I asked. But grandfather shook his head. I do not think so, darling child. He touched it to remind Jacob of it. Jacob carried that all the rest of his life. It was his place of remembering. I was very puzzled by this story, says Rachel. How could it be that one might confuse an angel with an enemy? But grandfather said this was the sort of thing that happened all the time. Even so, he told me, it is not the most important part of the story. The most important part of the story is that everything has its blessing. How tempting to let the enemy go and flee, to put the struggle behind you as quickly as possible and get on with your life. Life might be easier then, but far less genuine, he said. Perhaps the wisdom lies in engaging the life you have been given as fully and courageously as possible, and not letting go until you find the unknown blessing in everything. There's a passage from the Apostle Paul's letter to the Romans, appointed for today too, that reads, "You have not been given the Spirit of God to fall back into fear." Fear is a chronic problem. You think you've gotten over it, and it pops up again somewhere like grief or a nagging habit. Still, we can deal with it, and it can get easier as we go along. In her book, When Things Fall Apart, Pema Chodron speaks of how we get cornered by life from time to time. And she says it's fear that does this. And so she says this: so the next time you encounter fear, consider yourself lucky. This is where the courage comes in. Usually we think that brave people have no fear. She says, when I was first married, my husband said I was one of the bravest people he knew. And when I asked him why, he said, because I was a complete coward. but I went ahead and did things anyway. The trick is to keep exploring and not bail out, even when we find that something is not what we thought. That's what we're going to discover again and again. And this is the most important thing here. Nothing is what we thought. She says, I can say this with complete confidence. Emptiness is not what we thought. Fear, compassion, not what we thought. Love, courage, these are code words for things we don't know in our minds. But any of us could experience them. These are words that point to what life really is when we let things fall apart and let ourselves be nailed to the present moment. As Jacob finally let himself be nailed to that moment when he stopped running and faced his own life, his own demons. Everything worth facing. Amen.